an economy right at the heart of the economic establishment. From a former IMF chief economist,
Marx is right on a number of dimensions. He certainly is right that income inequality can be a source of tremendous tension.
to the man who saw the 2008 crisis coming.
He understood that there are situations in which capitalism and globalization can lead to economic crisis.
And an economist at one of the world's leading banks.
It's quite hard to convince people who live in Chelsea or Chelmsford that this is of great relevance to them, but actually it's worth a bash.
A bash. That's a good thing, I think. Try.
Communism is in for a shock. It's what he said about capitalism that rings so true today. Marx's key insight is that capitalism was inherently unstable. He said we lurched from crisis to crisis and society would become increasingly unequal.
I think she's on a vehicle that's lurching when she says it lurched.
And workers.
That's
For him, they would always be at odds, and that battle was a recipe for crises. To make profit, bosses squeeze what they pay workers. The crisis comes when workers then don't have enough money to buy what bosses are trying to sell them. And for decades after World War II, that looked completely wrong. We had years of stable growth, and the workers were taking a larger and larger share of the pie. But not anymore.
Marx would explain this crisis in terms of the fact that ordinary people haven't got enough money to spend. Why haven't they got enough money to spend? Because there's been a big redistribution over the last few decades away from ordinary people towards capital, towards wealth.
And for Marx, there's no turning back. He thought there were laws of motion running through human history. Capitalism would produce bigger and bigger crises, and then it would collapse. And he believed that the force driving us to this final collapse is the same one that built our world in the first place. The power of money.
Marx had a very simple formulation about crises, which is that they are manifestations of the fundamental flaws or contradictions, as he called them, of capitalism.
How would Marx have suggested solving the crisis is, of course, by abolishing capitalism.
Is capitalism living on borrowed time? Sometimes it doesn't feel that far-fetched. Here's why I've been thinking more about Marx. It's because the last few years hasn't felt like an ordinary recession. It hasn't felt like a crisis for one economy or for a group of economies in the West. At times it really has felt like a crisis for the system, for capitalism as we know it. You want a bigger explanation, and no one's ever had a bigger explanation for everything
this
that's happened.
next speaker is Slavoj Žižek. I think.
Capitalism's most implacable critic was born in the picture postcard town of Trier, in what is now southwest Germany. Today, his birthplace makes its own contribution to the local economy. It's a big draw for tourists. But do you still have a lot of people coming here, tourists?
Yeah,
from around the world?
we have more than 40,000 tourists here, and 25% came from China.
So a quarter of them come from China
Yes,
to
yeah.
see Marx's
Yeah,
birthplace. And what do they buy? What do they like?
do you like the red chocolate?
The Karl Marx chocolate. Maybe I should get some of that as well, actually.
And wine. Marx's father, Heinrich Marx, he had a vineyard nearby Trier.
And you don't think that Karl Marx would mind you selling all this stuff? big capitalist having this shop.
Perhaps he did enjoy it because he had a good humor too.
Is this kind of thing boring, or do you find it interesting?
Had big dreams right from the start.
She's much prettier than me, that's for sure.
At 17, Marx had to write an essay about picking the right career. He said the best position in life was to serve all of mankind, so your deed would live on perpetually at work, and over your ashes would be shed the hot tears of noble people. I wonder, would that young man, that rather grand young man, be surprised to hear that his first home had been turned into a museum? Probably not. But for all his ambitions, Marx was hardly a model student. When he was at university in Berlin, he earned a reputation as a radical thinker.
Marx comes across as a young man, as this sort of energetic, fiery, hairy figure. He was known as the wild boar of the moor, which was his sort of Levantine complex. He was full of ideas, he was full of debate, he liked big drinking sessions and then deep philosophical debate about the nature of Christ and German Romanticism and politics.
By the time he was 24, Dr. Marx was a bit of a Renaissance man. He was an expert in law, philosophy, you name it. In fact, the only thing he didn't know much about was economics.
This is an important part.
That all changed in 1842. Marx, by now working as a journalist, heard about a controversy in this wood that would help shape his understanding of how the world works. Peasants taking sticks from the forest floor to use as firewood were being prosecuted for theft. Wood had been gathered here for centuries, but now the landowners had declared it belonged to them. What had been freely shared was now private property. You could say that thinking about this question turned Marx into an economist, but that wouldn't really capture it. He came to think that economics, the nature of economic relationships between people, were at the heart of absolutely everything.
The foundations of Marxist thinking was materialism. That when you cut away religion, ideology, politics, at its root were material relations between man, the need for food, the need to have a roof over your head. This is what ultimately drives so much of human interaction.
What was unique in Marx? He didn't see economy just as a special sphere. He saw economy as the structuring principle of the entire social totality.
For Marx, it all begins with private property, which divides the world starkly. There are those that have it, and those that don't.
Speaking of which, the quiz question today is, what is the difference between socialism and communism? By the way, Ellie, I post those on my notes, so if you're ever wondering what the quiz questions are ahead of time, if you go to my notes for that week, I usually have them highlighted as these are the 2 quiz questions. It seemed like you didn't realize that last class, so that's why I
Do not.
So let's this is, I highly recommend it. She actually has 3 videos that she does on the same topic. One is on Keynes, and the other one is on Hayek, and then Marx. So you might not think of them as related that way. Keynes is the one that argues that governments should use money in order to help the economy. Hayek is the one that says, nope, you're just going to make the economy worse if you do that. And then Marx says you should get rid of capitalism, period. Right? And so there are in a sense 3 different approaches to using money for the greater good. sounds very utilitarian. Of course, she's British, BBC. But let's look at the influences on Marx. Last class I was talking about how Hegel influenced Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard, in my opinion, based on what I've learned from professors and so on, took one aspect of Hegel and went, away with that and just focused on the self and was convinced the self is free. And that's the biggest issue for him. That's why angst, what shall I do? How can I be committed to a faith, a narrative? Think of it, right? What is faith? Faith is belief in a narrative. This is the story of my life and how I do this, that, what the goal is, etc. So how do you have a commitment to that when it's up to you to make one up, right? That's kind of the angsty part of Kierkegaard, and he convinced that society has nothing to do with determining for you what those choices are that you make. You're free, and you have to suffer the consequences of your decisions and so on and so forth. Marx, on the other hand, same class, remember, listening to Schelling's interpretation of Hegel's system, and then he takes it and goes just the opposite direction, which strikes me as absolutely fascinating, and that is to say that the sense of freedom that you get is totally false. There is no such thing. You have no free will. Everything is really totally determined by, causality. These things happen, and as a result, you do this, right? When you think of even people like Steven Pinker today, the Harvard psychologist that argues everything is, a matter of the brain doing what it does, and the decisions actually that you make can be monitored by a device so that you can see that your brain actually makes the decision for you before you realize that's your decision. Right? He does argue, well, but it is my brain, right? But the thing is, before I decide coffee or tea, my brain has actually already figured out, at least, nanoseconds before I decide, oh, tea, it's a decision that's already been made there. So in that sense, it's a causal development. But in the social sense, the kinds of things that you believe and so on are totally based on your peers, on your family, on your schooling, all that sort of thing. So that, if you look at the kinds of decisions you make through your life, those are, in a sense, predetermined and can be socially analyzed as data based on your class, your social class especially, right? And, where you live, what language you speak, all that stuff can be focused so that you can see that you're an average kind of person in that particular social cohort, or whatever you want to call it, right? And based on that, his argument is that society can just tell you what to believe, use propaganda in order to promote that, and change your life. So that, the government can literally decide, okay, we're going to make sure everybody gives as much as they can to the society and takes as little as they, as they need, and we'll just promote that, and everyone will switch to not being selfish and instead being concerned about everyone else, so that they're sharing constantly. Caring is sharing, that kind of thing, and you end up with a completely different society. And the communist government was really based on that kind of development. And by the way, its dismal failure was the result, right? Because there seems to be a biological aspect to our selfishness. Now it can be culturally changed depending on the way your society teaches you, but it's not that you can completely get rid of it. in the sense that the communist government thought that they might be able to do. Let's look at Ludwig Feuerbach real quick. Feuerbach means a stream on fire. A Bach is like a little creek, stream, you know, and Feuer, of course, is fire. You know, so Ludwig Feuerbach, kind of a fascinating name. And he was a slightly older individual. Notice he's born in 1804. Marx is born in 1818. So that's what, 14 years, right? But they hung out in the cafes together. And so Feuerbach is going to influence Marx, and his focus is on religion. And he argues that God is kind of an imaginary perfect guy. you know, so if I just think of all the characteristics that I highly like in a person and apply them to this ideal character, I can make God omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, you know, omnibeneficent, all-good, you know, all these exaggerated ideas. And by the way, none of them are possible in one particular individual, because you can't know everything, you can't be all good. I mean, you know, how does that work, etc. So the idea of religion is kind of being an opiate of the masses. Are you familiar with that phrase? Because Marx is famous for that religion is the opiate of the masses. Opiates were relatively new thing available, at least as far as I know, in Europe at the time. Freud is actually the one that's supposed to have introduced cocaine. If that makes sense. He introduced it as a cure for psychosis. And actually it works. And you're cured of your psychosis. The only trouble is now you're addicted to cocaine, which might be worse. I don't know. You know, and you know, if you're familiar with Lewis Carroll, which is Charles Dawson's, Charles, his real name wasn't Lewis Carroll. He was a math